Edmond and Unisafra Center for Brain Sciences is proud to continue the Heller lecture series in computational neuroscience, initiated by the ICNC and supported by Morgan and Michael Heller for 12 consecutive years. Each year we invite 4 speakers. I'm especially pleased and honored to welcome you, Professor Patricia Churchland, who will present tonight this opening lecture, which is also the closing lecture of the week symposium on the aims of brain research, scientific and philosophical perspective. Professor Churchland is a philosopher who is known in the world for her contribution to the interactions between neuroscience and philosophy. Quoting your webpage, it says, although many philosophers used to dismiss the relevance of neuroscience on grounds that what matters was the software, not the hardware, right? Increasingly, philosophers have come to recognize that understanding how the brain works is essential to the understanding of the mind. Patricia, I couldn't agree more. Since I personally know the children of Patricia, oops, doesn't move. Okay. So this is the work that you see. I just keep this showing you that the lecture of today has a long history and high productivity in bringing philosophy and neuroscience together in her publications and books. And since I know the 2 children of Pat personally, I can whisper in your ears, both of them, Anne and Mark, are young, established, excellent neuroscientists, not philosophers. The exciting workshop of this week was organized by Ori Schenker and her colleagues from the Sydney Edelstein Center for the History and Philosophy of Science. The workshop proves, in my view, that philosophers and neuroscientists can interact, should interact, and together make progress in understanding this amazing enigma, the brain. I would like to invite you, Patricia, to to be awarded the special certificate
Want me to come up?
given and signed by ESSEC director, myself, and the head of the teaching program, Professor Israel Menken, who sits right here. It says, the Heller Lecture Series in Computational Neuroscience award this certificate of recognition and appreciation to Patricia Churchland-Smith for her contribution to academic inquiry and exchange from the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences at Campus Edmond J. Safra, Givat Ram, Jerusalem, Israel, signed Elon Vadia, Israel Menken.
Lovely, thank you so much. Thank you.
It's now your turn. You just move to your lecture. Oh, I forgot to show you one thing. These are Morgan and Michael Heller, who are the ones who fund these lectures for so many years. So thank them. Thank you, Oli, for bringing this wonderful workshop this week, and thank you for attending the meeting and agreeing to talk to us.
There we go. Good. Thank you. I think that one will not be needed, and I'm going to put this under here. And yeah. Don't forget. No, you will help me not forget. Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I am totally thrilled to be here. It's a very great honor, and for me it's also a time of great learning, both culturally and in terms of the neuroscience. Many of the neuroscientists who are here I've known for a long time, and it's a very special thing to be visiting with you on your home ground even though, of course, I've met many of you at the Salk and at UCSD. I want to make a sort of cautionary remark before I start, and that is that what I want to do today is really to paint a kind of big picture. I'm going to draw on material from psychology, from anthropology, neuroscience, and elsewhere. And that means that often I won't be able to provide data at the level at which you are often used to getting it, although we can do that in the question period. So I will try to indicate where the relevant data come from, when they are available. Sometimes what I'll talk about is really only at the level of hypothesis, and I'll try to indicate that as best I can. So the talk today was motivated by something that had troubled me for a long time, and that was where moral values come from. And it's something that, of course, Aristotle had long pondered, as had many other philosophers. And although there were many suggestions about where values come from, it seemed to me, especially in the light of everything we knew from molecular biology, but also what we know from ethological studies of mammals living in groups in the wild, that we really had to address this in a biological way. And so I began to think about the deepest level of value, and that, of course, has to be that circuitry that was selected for so that it would serve the animal's needs, so that, as Paul MacLean used to put it, the animal would survive and succeed at the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. If the animal was not successful in those respects, then of course it would be somebody else's dinner and it would not pass on its genes. So in a very deep sense, value is at the ground floor. And when an animal sees something else as a predator, that's because its circuitry is designed to see it as having negative value. And I mention this kind of early on because there's often this view espoused by philosophers that facts are one thing and values are another, and never the twain shall meet. But I think while there's something right about that, there's also something that from a biological point of view is profoundly wrong. Because we know that what animals pay attention to, what they are motivated to do, what they act on, is not just, so to speak, naked perceptions, but they are perceptions imbued with value. They don't see the whole world, they see that part of the world that matters to them. So the fact-value distinction that most philosophers are interested in is really something that comes much later in sort of scientific thought. It is something that's very sophisticated, and it applies in a very different kind of way from these fundamental values that are absolutely essential to biology. Now, recognizing, of course, that by and large animals are organized to see to themselves, then evolutionary biologists have been puzzled by the question of morality. Why is it that some animals will incur a cost to themselves in order to produce a benefit to another? You can take that as a very rough and ready meaning of altruism for the moment. And so it has seemed to some evolutionary biologists that there is something sort of anti-biological, or if you like, anti-natural about moral behavior and abiding to or conforming to moral norms. And Richard Dawkins expresses this idea in his early book, The Selfish Gene, though I think he has actually changed his view about that. And that's partly because Darwin, pondering this very issue in The Descent of Man, his 1871 book, asked the question, where does our conscience, our feeling of thinking that this is okay and that is not okay as we evaluate a prospective action, where does that come from? And Darwin said that basically it comes from 3 things: our social instincts, habits and skills, and reason, or as we might now say, problem solving. Darwin did not have the benefit of 20th century molecular biology and neuroscience, and so these were very much hypotheses. What's new is that we can actually say quite a bit now about what social instincts, at least in birds and mammals, what those consist in. And we can say quite a bit in a very different way with a very different part of the brain. We can say what habits and skills and so forth consist in. And so we can build up a picture that is sort of consistent with this vision that Darwin had. I think at this point, the neurobiology of reasoning and problem solving has not gotten very far, but I expect that will change very soon. In this slide, I just really want to remind you, so we have on the vertical axis years in millions, horizontally is spatial spread. And we know that as early as 1.8, 1.6 million years ago, there were hominins on the face of the planet. We know, for example, that Homo erectus lasted more than 1 million years, that they had a brain size of about 800 cc's. So yours is about 13 to 1500. Their brains were really quite small. Nevertheless, we can see from archaeological data that they lived in groups, they had fire, they built themselves rafts, logs lashed together with vines, and got themselves out of Africa and into Indonesia. It's also significant that some of these Homo species overlapped, and of course, as I'm sure you know, we, Homo sapiens, overlapped with the Neanderthals for about 30,000 years. We're not quite sure, but we do also know that there was group living amongst all of those individuals, and based on what we know from existing hunter-gatherer groups, such as the Inuit in the Arctic or various tribes that live in Brazil, we know that these individuals had norms, moral practices, conventions, rituals, and so forth. That it wasn't simply that they had none of those things, and several other points are relevant here. One is that with regard to Homo sapiens, we do not see anything that you might call organized religion until well after the development of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And this is true, for example, also of the hunter-gatherer groups extant now that we know something about. The Inuit, for example, speak of the spirits of the whales and the spirits of the seals, but those play no role in their moral norms, as, for example, when they adjudicate a conflict between individuals, or when they decide what sort of punishment is appropriate for a miscreant. It's also very interesting and important that we disabuse ourselves of the assumption that moral norms and practices come into being only when we sit down and talk about it. One of the things that Rasmussen, an early anthropologist of the Inuit, discovered was that it's very difficult to get the Inuit to articulate the moral norms and practices and conventions. They know very well what they are, and they exhibit them in behavior, but they don't articulate them. So if one is tempted to think that our moral values and norms derive from supernatural sources, I think the anthropological data really do provoke us to rethink that assumption. And certainly in my own case, it makes me think we need to look much deeper. We need to look to biology. I am going to connect sociality and morality in a way that you'll see in a moment. And I want to begin that discussion by saying that sociality almost certainly evolved many times. As we know, for example, color vision has evolved many times. In fish and in insects, there is certainly a very highly organized, highly structured kind of sociality. The kind that I'm interested in is vastly more flexible. It allows for tremendous amounts of learning, especially by a kind of learning that we think is probably unique to or close to being unique to mammals and birds. So there's something very special that emerges in the sociality of mammals and birds. These are crows, and as I'm going to mention later, of course, we know that many very bright mammals have a long period of development. It's also true that the corvids, ravens, crows, magpies, jays, have a long period of development, whereas chickens, you know, they lay the egg is warm, out comes the chicken, and off he goes. All right. Now, I want to have a quick aside here. Some of you will have heard this before, but it's an important way, I think, to kind of frame the rest of the discussion. So the general point is that our everyday concepts, the ones that we use when we're getting on and we're at home and we're in the marketplace and we're just chatting to other people, have a radial structure. And what that means is that at the center there are prototypes, maybe a group of them. At the outer edges, the boundaries are very fuzzy. We don't know whether something counts as being in that category or not. And in between, with declining degrees of similarity, are other cases. And so this applies to many kinds of things, whether it's chairs or friends or vegetables or flowers or what have you. Rivers, creeks, mountains. There is no sharp division as to what counts as a mountain. And this turns out to be true of many things. So just to illustrate, vegetable. Carrot is a prototypical vegetable. Probably potatoes are, at least in the West. Further out from the prototypical, from the core cases, are things like maybe squash or radishes. And then way out on the boundary where it's very fuzzy, people just don't agree. I mean, you know, are wild mushrooms really vegetables, or are they really not? And by and large, we don't really care. And nobody, except perhaps for certain philosophers who think that all categories must have necessary and sufficient conditions, nobody loses any sleep about it. And if you call a chanterelle mushroom that's found in the wild a vegetable, I don't lose any sleep over it. The same is true, for example, of houses. And what I want to say here is to emphasize the fact that what counts as a prototypical instance of a category can vary as a function of culture. And this, of course, will be especially important in the context of talking about morality. So in Texas, that's a prototypical house. In the Arctic, that is. And out on desert areas, that is, and so forth. Now, what about social categories? It appears from the work that, again, that anthropologists and psychologists have done, that these sorts of categories have the same kind of structure. And moreover, we learn those categories by basically learning the prototypes, what counts as a friend, what really doesn't, and what, well, maybe they do and maybe they don't. You gotta kind of watch them. And the same is true, I believe, of the more general category, moral and not moral. So it's not that, like, say, the word protein, that you can give a very precise definition for it. What we can do is talk about the prototypical cases and the cases that are, in a way, prototypically not considered to be instances of what is moral. So that's the basic aside. In order, I think, to understand a little bit about what makes sociality in mammals and birds unique and important, it's useful to put it into an evolutionary context. Now, although there are many things that are not understood at all about the evolution of the mammalian brain, we have some pretty good guesses about important events that took place at some point or other. One very important event that had to have taken place early on was that some reptile underwent mutations such that it became a homeotherm. It was able to regulate its own temperature. And that meant it could hunt at night, which was both safer and more productive. And it could also live in places, in climates, where the cold-blooded animals couldn't live. Animals like dinosaurs, lizards, and so forth. So that's a great upside, the development of homeothermy. The downside is that gram for gram, if you're a homeotherm, you have to eat 10 times as much. And what that means is that for any given patch, many fewer mammals can be supported on that patch than on reptiles. So suddenly you have a constraint. And part of what we think in the evolution of the mammalian family, what we think happened was that fewer offspring were born. Also, the individuals began to move further afield, where perhaps their genetic and innate endowment no longer served them very well, but if they had the capacity to learn, tune themselves up to that new environment, then they did very well. So part of what we see in the development of mammals is something, of course, you all know very well. And that is, in something like a crocodile, you have a very small little brain and essentially no neocortex. By the time you get to rodents, they've got a very nice neocortex. Rhesus, chimpanzees, much bigger brains. And by the time you get to humans, we have very large brains indeed. Although it will amuse you greatly, perhaps, to know that the cranial cavity of Neanderthal was actually larger than the cranial cavity of Homo sapiens. Now, what do I mean by cortex? Well, in the case of crocodiles and turtles and pre-mammals, there is a kind of, on the surface, a sort of, loosely speaking, two-layer structure where there are interactions between neurons. But what you see in the case of mammals is what we call neocortex, which I'm sure everybody here knows very well, but I'll just basically mention it again, because it's new with humans, with mammals. We also now think that birds have it, it's just that it's all kind of wrapped up in a different package, so it's not so easy to recognize. So the cortex is here stained for purple, and it's that outer rind. And you can see if you blow up a section of cortex that it has this amazingly regular structures where certain types of cells are standardly found in certain kinds of layers and make very particular kinds of connections. And we know much more about the cortex now than we did, say, 20 years ago, partly because of the amazing work that's been done here by people like, for example, Idon Segev. But the cortex is not, of course, the whole story. In any case, and now I'm going to kind of get to the heart of sociality in mammals. What we see with mammals is something that we all kind of know about but don't necessarily discern the implications of. And that is the learning capacity goes way up. So any mammal can learn vastly more and tune itself up to a much wider range of environmental conditions than can, say, a turtle. Now, it too has a downside, but as it were, Mother Nature realized that if you're going to have an organism that's going to tune itself up to many different environments and many different situations, then it has to be born very immature. And so all mammals are. There are exceptions with regard to ungulates, but that was a kind of later evolution. And in the earliest evolution of mammals, you just need to think about rodents, rats, and mice, and beavers, for example. The young are born very immature. Part of what they learn is how to cope with the existing environment, but part of what they learn, and perhaps, and some people think this, the most amazing thing that they have to learn is about their social environment, where their social environment involves things that are much more complex, for example, than nuts and berries. other biological entities. And so the thought seems to be, and we don't know whether this is true, that part of what drove this massive expansion of the brain was the increasing social complexity that animals found themselves in, and the advantages in being just a little bit smarter than your compatriots. In this slide, which most people will have seen versions of, we know that there is tremendous growth at the level of the individual neuron, tremendous arborization of the dendrites, tremendous arborization of the axonal connections. Scholler tells us that the brain grows 5-fold from birth to adulthood. All right, so we have this really very interesting thing, this great dependency of the newborn mammal, because this mammal is going to learn about its environment. But something had to change at some point in the story, we don't know when. It had to change. And it had to be that the mom, who used to only really care for her own food and warmth and welfare, now must sacrifice her own desires to flit about to care for the offspring. And that turns out, it seems, to have involved a rewiring of subcortical structures. So when a mother, before the babies arrive, feels hungry or thirsty, or she's afraid of a predator, she feels a kind of pain. Fear is a kind of pain. Fear is nature's way of anticipating the pain that a predator would cause. She also then will feel great pleasure when she eats, when she's safe, and when she's warm. And it turns out that the structures of pleasure and pain can be manipulated by lower level circuitry in the hypothalamus so that we extend our own caring to those of offspring. And so during the very early stages, when a mother rat or a mother human is suckling the baby or just cuddling it or caring for it, both the baby and the mother feel good. They both feel pleasure. They feel pain when they're separated. And then, unique to mammals and birds, you also get vocalization, otherwise known as crying or squealing. In both the brain of the mother and the brain of the infant, oxytocin is released during those occasions. And stress hormones are released when there is separation or when the young are hungry or cold and the mother hears them squeal and she has to do something. Oxytocin is a very ancient peptide. It is found in or its homologue is found in many animals long before mammals are ever on the scene. But what we think is that in the mammalian brain and in the avian brain, it's put to rather different uses. Just to remind you then, the hypothalamus is a very tiny subcortical structure and blown up. We can see it here. Oxytocin is released from the supraoptic nucleus and from the paraventricular nucleus, and it's actually released in several, really 3 interesting ways, which kind of shows you that not everything conforms to, you know, the standard style of how neurohormones should work. So in some instances, oxytocin is just released into the pituitary and then into the bloodstream. In some instances, it's released from areas higher up, and it diffuses through the hypothalamus to reach various receptors where it binds, but it also has very specific projections to things in the reward system, where you feel good when that connection is made because oxytocin turns those neurons on, and those neurons turn on neurons in the nucleus accumbens. Now, The hypothesis then that I'm interested in has several parts, but the most basic part goes like this, that sociability turns out to be a basic value for mammals. Now, I've already talked about its value in the case of dependent offspring, but it turns out, of course, as Darwin emphasized, to be very important for group living. Animals can, if they live in a group, can bring down a large predator or foil a predator, as the case may be. But in sociality in mammals, we don't know whether this is true in fish or insects. The hub of the story really is oxytocin, and I suppose I really should say it's sibling peptide vasopressin. It's a very simple peptide, and it differs from vasopressin really in only 2 places. So they're very, very ancient, very simple, but it turns out that they are very important. Of course, they do not act alone, and I must emphasize that, but they are a crucial part of the story of sociality. And towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how norms emerge from the reward system. So that's going to be a story that's different from the story of the hypothalamus. It's going to be a story about the basal ganglia. It's going to be a story about how reinforcement learning, which we're now beginning to really understand, how reinforcement learning in the basal ganglia underwrites things like habits and skills. So roughly to sum up so far then, early in evolution we have sort of egocentric organization of circuitry, but then we come to have circuitry that expands. Now we want to know a little bit more, of course, because morality involves not just offspring. And so what I want to look at now is how it goes from me to kin, not just offspring, but to others in the family, or from me to kin, and finally to kith, by which I mean friends and others in the group. Up top we have marmosets, and down here we have baboons. Now I'm quickly going to tell the story of the prairie voles, because I think this is a story most of you know, but prairie voles are different from various other kinds of voles in that after the first mating, they tend to bond for life. The question that was asked by researchers, Larry Young, Sue Carter, and many others, was this. We know meadow voles don't do that, or montane voles don't do that, but prairie voles do. What's the difference in the brain? Now, many people thought that you'd never find the answer, that'd be way too complex, and so forth. But it turns out that we have at least a very strong line on the answer. So here what we're looking at is a cross-section of brain from montane voles that are not pair bonders and prairie voles that are. OTR means oxytocin receptor. This means vasopressin receptor. And the basic difference that was found where it was in the reward pathways in the prairie vole, we have the nucleus accumbens, highly stained for oxytocin receptors, showing that there's a much greater density of oxytocin receptors in this very specific part of the reward system. And in the ventral pallidum, there is a high density of vasopressin receptors. Now, many experiments then were followed. People block the receptors in the prairie voles, and you don't get long-term bonding. They did transgenic mice who hitherto had not been bonders, but you do the transgenic manipulation, and they are bonders. And many, many kinds of experiments were done. The upshot being that it does look like oxytocin and vasopressin are extremely important components. Of course, not the only ones, but they're extremely important components of the story of sociality. Then, of course, began the project of trying to understand what the oxytocin really does in the mammalian brain. And this turns out to be a very complex story, but at least some things we do know, and that is that it decreases autonomic arousal. And so, in other words, You know, a conspecific comes into the camp and you're alert, you're wary, you don't know, who is this guy? And he behaves in a decorous, safe fashion, and what happens is your stress hormones go down, the fight and flight reactions decrease, oxytocin levels go up, you come to trust one another, and then before very long, you may actually be grooming one another, and so forth. The other thing that we know about oxytocin, which is very interesting, is that it does seem to enhance the saliency of social signals. Not all signals, not everything that someone does, for example, in a first meeting is relevant, but we do know that there are quite a few things that matter greatly in the determination of whether this is a friend or not, whether this is really somebody who is going to manipulate and take advantage or not. In this slide, I just want to really draw attention to the fact that one of the things that needed to be done in the research on sociality was to try to compare the brains and the receptor densities in various structures across different species. Prairie voles, of course, as I've mentioned, are very social. They not only do they bond for life. By the way, I didn't say what that means. What that means is that the male will always guard the nest. He really hangs around the female a lot. They like to be together. They just hang out together. Whereas something like that is not true of meadow voles. So it was important to try to begin to contrast the brains, especially in those subcortical structures involving reward. One of the surprising things that came out was that some animals, like meadow voles, actually have a high density of oxytocin receptors in the lateral septum. And you can see that in this slide up there. So what does that mean? I mean, if they've got all these oxytocin receptors, why aren't they nice? Why aren't they social? And it seems to be that oxytocin's effect is very circuit selective. So when Paul Zak, for example, called oxytocin the love molecule, it kind of depends on where oxytocin is acting. And even in prairie voles, but this is also true of all mammals, oxytocin is needed for the female to guard the nest, to guard her young against predators. And that ferociousness that you see in mother bears or mother rats or cats or pigs depends on oxytocin. It depends on oxytocin in the brain. So what we know is that we need to understand not just that oxytocin is important, but how precisely it acts in the circuitry. And by and large, at this stage, we don't know. Now, it has sometimes been suggested that whenever you see a behavior that's quite common across individuals in a species, that you can say that it's innate. And this has come under withering fire, shall I say, in the last couple of decades. And in the context of thinking about cooperation, I think one of the things that we need to consider is not that there is a gene for cooperation, which almost certainly there is not, but that once individuals trust each other, are comfortable with each other, are friends with each other, cooperation can emerge. And it can emerge because they have a common problem that they need to solve. So in this slide, I just kind of want to dramatize that by talking about some of my favorite animals, and those are wolves. So way up in the north, the wolves are off doing their own thing, and one wolf will come into an area and begin to howl. And you probably all know what that sounds like, so I won't produce it here. And the other wolves congregate. They all come in from wherever it is they are. And it's like when your dog meets another dog, and they're happy to see each other, and they bounce together, and then the alpha male mates everybody so everybody knows who's in charge, and then off they go on a hunt. right. So in this particular instance, what they do is they go for a long distance, actually, and they come upon a grizzly who has brought down a caribou. Now, a lone grizzly might do that. A lone wolf certainly cannot. So what's going on? Well, you can see the wolves, and they're very strategically placed. This is something wolves learn. Of course, they are perhaps innately motivated to learn, but this is something that they learn. And what happens here is that they harass and harass and harass the grizz until they drive him off. Now, you wouldn't think that's possible, but it certainly is. And so eventually then, they get a kill for free, so to speak. And that's a lovely example of cooperation. And that's cooperation within a species. But I want to mention another kind of cooperation involving this guy. So who is this guy? It's a raven. And what's he doing there? So you have to ask yourself, how did the wolves know where to go? And the answer is, the raven, who can, of course, survey a huge territory, because he can fly, the raven knows where the kill is. The raven comes back to the wolves. The raven alerts the wolves by calls and so forth that there is action to be had. And then the raven, going tree by tree and hopping along and flying, leads the wolves to the kill. So you might say, so that's a nice little raven. What's in it for him? And the answer is, well, this is an instance of mutualism. Because then what the raven does is he goes off and gets all his buddies. He calls them. They all arrive. By then, these guys have had a decent meal. And then the ravens harass and harass and harass the wolves and drive them off. And the ravens settle in. So it's a lovely example both of really sort of remarkable within species cooperation that if you ever have a chance to see it on YouTube or whatever, to see how wolves do it, it's really astonishing. But it's also a wonderful instance of learned cross-species cooperation. We don't know how they came to learn this, but learn it they did. And now I want to say a little bit about norms. I do want to leave time for questions. So it seems that one of the great advantages of having altricial brains that are very immature when born is that you can learn a lot about your environment, but especially about your social environment, about what all of those little tiny gestures mean. You can also learn about all of the conventions, the practices, the norms, and so forth. And we think that this is done mainly by the basal ganglia. I'm just going to move on. Mainly by the basal ganglia, but of course in its connectivity to the prefrontal structures. So the basal ganglia is shown here, and these structures here and there, so on both sides. And there are cortical basal ganglia loops involving the thalamus, and of course loops within the basal ganglia themselves. But these, all of these connections within the basal ganglia involve reward. They involve acquiring the appropriate affect, or if you like, acquiring a conscience. Acquiring the feeling that changing a tire needs to be done this way, or that making kindling needs to be done this way. And it feels right when you do it properly, and it feels wrong when you don't do it properly. And similarly for various rituals and conventions. That if we have been rewarded and punished with respect to a certain practice when we're young, we come to feel that that is the right way to do it, and only that is the right way to do it. And we feel kind of uneasy when we don't do it in the standard way. And I think that's what that great expansion of cortex that we see in monkeys, chimpanzees and bonobos, and then in humans, I think that's probably what that's all about. Just in this slide, I'm just going to do this very quickly. I want to say that just as there are very similar principles that all cultures seem to follow with regard to something like boat making, like rocks aren't a good idea, but wood is, that naturally fall out of a reasonable problem-solving capacity. So we see the same thing with regard to boats. So the Haida, who live in a very wild territory and need to whale and catch salmon, have these very powerful seaworthy boats, whereas the Inuit are not subject to great storms that kick up wild waves, and kayaks are precisely the sort of thing that they need. And so the hypothesis is that this basic platform whereby within a social group we care for our offsprings, we care for our mates, we care for our friends, is used as a way of scaffolding the norms and practices that we come to associate with morality. Over time they can change, just as I'm sure the Inuit did not instantly discover that the kayak was the perfect boat for their territory. So I think social practices change over time. Trial by ordeal was used for many hundreds of years, but it was, of course, ultimately a very unstable institution. Trial by ordeal, for example, if you were accused of adultery, the idea was that a red-hot poker would be put in your hand, and if your hand burned, you were guilty, and if it didn't burn, well, you probably weren't guilty. And the reason why this system was believed to work was that God would intervene if you were not guilty. Well, it turned out a lot of people were guilty, not surprisingly. All right. Within group competition never leaves us because that brainstem circuitry, that really deep circuitry that makes us care for ourselves, never goes away, even when we care for others. Now, my main interest really has been in addressing the platform that makes possible the kind of morality that we are familiar with now. And I think the two components are likely to have, in the case of humans, but others, are likely to have to do with this very highly structured and organized system of involving oxytocin and vasopressin, together with the system for reinforcement learning. But of course, once humans became very numerous, once agriculture became a way of life and settled towns formed, then a very interesting thing happened. And I'm going to go to this next slide and I'll come back to that other one. So, for all of you who've lived in a very small town, as I did when I grew up, it's hard to do bad things, even if you can get over your conscience, because everybody knows everybody else. And all it really takes is a sort of a frown or a wagged finger, and the knowledge that they know you and they know your mom and dad, and so you're going to be in trouble. Now, part of what happens when you get very large groups is that people don't know each other in that way. Now, Robin Dunbar, who is an anthropologist, has this hypothesis that relative to a particular size of brain, you're really able to handle only so many friends. I don't mean friends in that Facebook sense. I mean friends where you really know them, you care about them, you can do stuff with them, you keep track of them, and so forth. And he thinks it's about 150 people. And it's interesting, or at least he thinks it's interesting, and I guess I do too, that by and large, hunter-gatherer groups are about between 30 and 150. They seem not to be much larger. With the advent of agriculture and settled communities and farming, all that changed. And that's when we begin to see what we think of as as sort of prototypical morality, and that is where people get together, formulate laws, and say, this is the way we have to do things. It's also when we see organized religion emerged. And at least one of the arguments is that the real point of much organized religion was to have an unseen supernatural presence who would frown at you and wag his finger when you are not seen by anybody else. And so this unseen presence would act as a kind of surrogate. I mean, it's a very old idea, but in the context of what we're understanding from anthropologists, it seems to make a lot of sense. The oxytocin story, the oxytocin vasopressin story, seems also to have some implications for bonding within groups and the tendency, at least amongst humans, to develop very specific kinds of conventions and practices, to develop sometimes very specific kinds of rituals that demarcate them either in their clothing or in their dancing or their chanting from the outgroup. I don't have time to talk about that and why in-group bonding and out-group hostility may go together. And I'm going to finish up with this slide, which I know can seem a bit like a cheesy slide, but actually I want to make a real point here. So this is an orang, and as we all learned from basic zoology, orangs are loners. And this is true in their natural habitat because they're vegetarians. Each needs a very large territory so that they can eat the leaves and not destroy the trees. So apart from mother-infant relationships, orangs tend to be loners. On the other hand, we know, of course, that orangs are also very smart, and, but it does seem odd that they are not very social. Well, it turns out, I mean, and this is one of the things I think we're going to always find in big-brained mammals, with these great big cortices connected in these multifarious ways to basal ganglia, that when the resources are adequate, loner mammals are quite happy to be social. And so in this instance, this guy was at a rescue center in Iowa, and one day the hound dog comes loping on into the center, and he kind of checks everything out, and he finds Rusty. And somehow they became very close friends. And they do everything together, including sharing food, which is kind of interesting for a dog. And you can see that they swim together. This is a very natural, unstaged bit of behavior. Now, what I like about this slide, I mean, apart from its heartwarming side, is that it reminds us that there's tremendous flexibility in the domain of sociality. And even within any species, there's going to be a lot of variability. But depending on resources, depending on conditions, we may see quite different social behaviors emerge. The fact that an orang has the inclination to bond, to make a friend in this way, I think does tell us that the circuitry and the structure is there, but given the circumstances, he tends or she tends, by and large, not to express it. And with that, I'll just flash the book that's relevant to this, and I'd love to take questions. Namaste.
I'm wondering if there's something about the brain taking care of itself, or rather the parts of the brain taking care of each other. The right hand washing the left hand has something to do with also the larger brain then also other brains and interacting with them socially?
Yeah, gosh, I never thought about it like that exactly. I mean, certainly we know the emotions are really very strongly engaged, and that probably means that regions like the amygdala are engaged, and we probably, many people suspect, as do I, that the endogenous opiates play a real role here as well. So I was sort of really thinking about it generally in that level. I don't actually know whether one part of the brain takes care of another part or not. I have to think about that. But of course, the other thing about modularity, as many people have thought about it in terms of the brain for some time, is that, you know, the grip of modularity is loosening and loosening and loosening. And yes, there are areas which during development come to be specialized and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we know there is a tremendous amount of plasticity. So what we really don't know, I mean, and this is a really deep question, which I think people like Alain have wondered about for a long time, is what really are the principles of organization? It isn't modular in anything like a strict, you know, this does faces and this does something else. This can't possibly do faces on its own. It's got to be part of a big network. And if, as an infant, you're missing that piece, doesn't mean you're not going to learn to recognize faces. You can miss your whole left hemisphere, as some infants do after surgery. They learn language pretty normally. In fact, if you lose your whole right hemisphere as an infant, your language learning milestones are delayed relative to those kids who lost their whole left hemisphere. So much that we, you know, would like, I mean, it's a simplifying assumption to think there are modules in the brain. It doesn't really look like it. What there is, dunno. Yeah. Yeah.
But there are lots of evidence coming out of psychology, especially talking about sort of a very early disposition to favor your in-group.
Oh yeah, I know.
And oxytocin also has been involved in
yeah.
that kind of discourse as well.
Absolutely.
Perhaps oxytocin also sort of prompts one to be selected, to be favorable towards
Yeah.
the in-group.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think these are still really early days. So the question is whether or not oxytocin is playing a role in the in-group bonding versus out-group hostility. And I think it's really hard to know. The particular example, experiment that I bet you're thinking about is from Dedru's lab. Yeah, and they used humans and they sprayed oxytocin up the nose, and what they found was that it was a modest effect, but an effect was that there was a tendency after the nasal spray to be more hostile to the out group and more bound to the in group. I don't know what to make of it because we don't know anything about oxytocin receptor density in humans. We don't know really anything in any animal about how much oxytocin gets into the brain when you puff it up the nose. And the result was quite modest. Having said all these sort of cautionary things, and I don't mean to be negative because I think it's a very interesting question, I think there are real issues about understanding the nature of this phenomenon that we see again and again, that whether it's a group of bikers selling drugs in Los Angeles, or whether it's the Chargers hating the Raiders in football in my town. We see this all the time, and it does clearly involve pleasure. I mean, one of the things I find absolutely fascinating is that our town has the San Diego Chargers, and the Raiders are from Oakland, and the fans really hate each other. Now, I'm sure if they ever called upon to work together, they do. they love to hate each other. And they dress up in ways to humiliate the other. And they are having the best time. And they spend serious money on these costumes designed to try to ridicule the other guys. It's mostly men, and it's mostly young men. And the women are there, cheering them on. It's very interesting. And we don't understand it, but I think it's deeply important that we do.
Okay, yeah.
I want to ask you a question. Some scholars look at the values as being part of the made of different dimensions, like individualism, collectivism, or autonomy versus embeddedness, hierarchy versus mastery.
Yeah.
Can you relate some brain functions to those kind of dimensions of values?
I don't think one can. I mean, I think the values that we see in a highly, a culture that's the product of many, many years of cultural evolution, I think it would be very hard to relate those in any meaningful and direct way to anything in the brain. I mean, what's clear is we like to be with other people. And we like to be with other humans, although there's great variability. I mean, where I grew up, there were prospectors who had a dog and were out in the bush for 11 months of the year, and then came wandering in to buy flour and sugar, and then went off again. And they appeared to be very happy to be by themselves. But most people would find that quite tough. And we do like to be alone sometimes, but we like to be together. Now, out of that can emerge all kinds of interesting cultural developments, which can vary hugely across the planet. So I wouldn't look very directly, actually, for things like that. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay.